On Press Perspective today, we touch upon the ambitions surrounding submarines here in South Korea as well as over in Canada to bolster security at sea. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Thursday, May 21st here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we revisit a number of stories related to submarines as well as broader security at the sea and beyond. For more, I have freelance journalist Yang Chien-Hao live on the line. Chien-Hao, it's great to have you on.
Hello, Sunny. Good to be here today.
All right. I also have independent journalist Kelly Kasulis Cho here in the studio with us. Kelly, it's great to have you here.
Always a pleasure.
Chien-Hao, we start with you. Let's begin with South Korea's bid then for the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project. Briefly, tell us a bit about this project. What is it? Why is it, if you will? And who are the two bidders?
Yes, so this issue is actually tied to the rise of the so-called K-defense industry. Canada's current submarines are second-hand vessels purchased from the United Kingdom back in the 1990s, and they are now aging and in need of replacement and modernization. And as we know, Canada's territory stretches across the Arctic, the Pacific, and also the Atlantic. Protecting its maritime borders is a major national security priority. And with global warming making previously frozen Arctic routes more accessible now, the region is becoming increasingly strategic, especially because of its vast untapped natural resources. And that's why Canada is now pushing ahead with the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project, aiming to acquire up to 12 conventionally powered submarines. And naturally, there's growing attention over which country, which company will ultimately win the bid. And at the moment, the two main contenders are Germany's TKMS with its Type 212CD design and South Korea's Hanwha Group offering the KSS-3 submarine. The final decision is expected by the end of this year, after which construction would begin with deliveries projected sometime after 2030. In recent years, the Hanwha Group has exported weapon systems such as the K9 self-propelled howitzer to several European countries. And now with Canada's submarine procurement project, South Korea has once again emerged as a major player, highlighting the growing competitiveness of the country's defense manufacturing industry.
Right, and keeping in mind what Chien-Hao has just said, Kelly, what more can you tell us about the prospects of the two potential suppliers, South Korea's Hanwha Ocean and Germany's TKMS?
Well, just to start, I think it's important to explain why we're talking about this and why this is such a big deal. I mean, this is a really colossal project. It may not sound like much, but 12 of these submarines, I mean, that's billions and billions of dollars. Industry experts are estimating that this deal, whether it's won by South Korea or Germany, would be worth about $12 billion. In the Korean context, the overall package could generate tens of billions of US dollars, generate 20,000 jobs. And as Chien-Hao pointed out, it's kind of an emerging front in which South Korea's export-driven economy could further advance the defense industry. And right now we're seeing with the crisis in the Middle East and the energy, South Korea's ability to contribute to defense around the world is really coming in clutch in terms of Seoul kind of using its diplomatic prowess to secure some energy reserves. So this is kind of a high stakes deal. My understanding is it would be the biggest deal in Canadian military history. With that said, so we're looking at two major conglomerates, South Korea's Hanwha or Germany's TKMS, and they're both bidding for this project. What Germany kind of has to offer, the way that it's trying to sell itself, is really its reputation. I mean, since World War II, Germany has been kind of known as a great arms manufacturer, defense systems builder, and that reputation has really been solidified in the NATO alliance. It plays that role very well on the world stage. South Korea, on the other hand, is really selling itself on innovation cooperation and speed. So, South Korea has said that it would be much faster. It would essentially shake up the status quo for the kind of production turnaround that we could expect for something like this. And of course, Korea is also, potentially offering a greater package of cooperation on defense, maybe even some economic stimulus with Canada. So there's been much talk, for instance, about would Hyundai, build a plant in Canada or something like that to sweeten up this deal. That has not been confirmed. The other thing I think that's important to note is, as the headline that was on the screen pointed out, Canada's not turning necessarily to the U.S. for this desire to upgrade its Navy. And I believe that this deal would make it kind of the most powerful submarine system outside of the United States within the NATO alliance. And this really kind of shows yet another example of a country that has a traditional alliance with the United States, that has relied on this kind of international liberal world order, maybe feeling a bit undermined by some of the fraying relationships in Washington, and feeling that it needs to really build up its own defense, its self-reliance, if you will, because this uncertainty diplomatically means that every country, France often talks about this, for instance, that they need to be able to defend themselves and be ready.
Right, indeed. Chien-Hao, last week, the CEO of the Canadian branch of Hanwha spoke to a Canadian digital daily about the ways in which Hanwha could launch a decades-long investment in Canada if it wins this bid. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, and first of all, one of the biggest advantages Hanwha currently has is its ability to deliver submarines quickly, and while also offering broader investment opportunities. And this is no longer just about a simple defense contract. It also involves potential cooperation in mining, heavy industry, and defense production, helping Canada strengthen its industrial infrastructure and even expand into space sector. In fact, Hanwha has recently signed a series of strategic partnership agreements with Canadian companies in heavy industry and aerospace, and it is also planning industry academia cooperation projects with many universities in Canada. And Hanwha has even pledged that if it wins the submarine deal, it even could eventually mass produce armored vehicles inside Canada. If that happens, Canada's defense capabilities would be significantly strengthened, while South Korea could also gain a larger role in North American security cooperation. And since the end of World War II, Canada has spent most of its modern history in relative peace without majority military conflicts or large-scale military operations. And as defense demand declined and also the globalization accelerated, parts of Canada's industrial base also gradually weakened over time. And at the same time, many of Canada's weapon systems and military facilities have traditionally been built by American companies. But after President Trump returned to office, we can see tensions between the United States and Canada have increasingly come into focus. And now Canada is looking to work more closely with other countries to build high-quality naval vessels and infrastructure, while also reducing its dependence on the United States, diversifying risks, and strengthening its long-term maritime security capabilities.
Right, and beyond Canada's ambitions for submarines, Kelly, what's the latest with regard to South Korea's plan to build nuclear-powered submarines?
Well, when it was first kind of speculated that South Korea was pursuing this goal, it was quite a splash in terms of international headlines. And now the latest reports, which are not confirmed out in the open, largely in Western media and citing anonymous sources, is that South Korea might unveil an official confirmation that it has a plan to acquire nuclear-powered submarines later this month. We don't know if that's the case. It wouldn't necessarily be surprising, although it would have major consequences. President Trump essentially greenlit that plan verbally last year. South Korea's defense minister has said that, South Korea needs to upgrade its Navy to, quote unquote, be strong support for the U.S. in the event of a conflict or something like that. Why does this matter? Obviously, broadly, Korea is kind of in this war defense posture, although things seem quite peaceful in the South, because there's technically an ongoing conflict with North Korea. So the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, technically did not officially end. It was just an armistice agreement, or a ceasefire, if you will. And so South Korea has to be in this position to kind of always be prepared for a potential North Korean invasion, right? And so At the same time, for years and years, there's been a lot of work on non-proliferation on the Korean Peninsula, trying to convince North Korea to walk back its weapons advancements. And so there's a fear that this could essentially trigger an even more intense arms race, that it could potentially violate or undermine some non-proliferation treaties around the world, and that it could raise the stakes for the potential of a conflict. I mean, certainly if South Korea were to acquire these, it would look like more of a threat. At the same time, again, with frayed alliances and kind of a slight collapse in this idea of a liberal international order, there's always that question of, should South Korea be able to defend itself on its own, and is it ready to do that? And so I think that's why there's been a lot of proponents for this kind of, pursual of something more powerful.
Right, and with regard to defense, but staying at sea, Chien-Hao, South Korea for the first time will command, I believe, the world's largest international maritime exercise this coming summer. First then, could you tell us a bit about the biannual Rim of the Pacific exercise, including its history, purpose, as well as scale?
Yes, so RIMPAC, or the Rim of the Pacific exercise, began in 1971, and it was originally launched by the United States Navy's Third Fleet as a way of allied navies to conduct joint military operations together. And today, the exercise is held every 2 years. Besides combat training, it also includes disaster response and humanitarian assistance missions. And the 2026 RIMPAC exercise is scheduled to take place from June 24th to July 31st around the Hawaii Islands. And the drills are expected to bring together for 31 countries. And South Korea has participated in RIMPAC since 1990. And during the 2024 exercise, it was the last time South Korea served as the deputy commander of the Maritime Task Force. And this year, it has been elevated to commander, and a sign of the country's growing military capabilities and rising international status. And looking back at the records over the past 3 decades, only a handful of countries have consistently participated in every RIMPAC exercise, including the United States, Japan, and Canada, Australia, and South Korea. And it's also worth noting that China took part in 2014 and 2016 exercises, but has not yet participated since then. And Russia, meanwhile, only joined the 2012 drill. And South Korea taking command of this year's exercise also reflects that the country is no longer just a participant, and it is increasingly being seen as a trust coordinator. And in today's security environment, simply possessing advanced weapons and strong military capabilities is no longer enough. South Korea must also demonstrate that it can communicate effectively with other partner militaries, persuade allies to understand and accept operational plans, and build trust and coordination among participating forces. And that requires a very different kind of expertise. And in everyday terms, it may resemble managing traffic in a crowded city during peak hours, except in RIMPAC, the traffic consists of missiles, helicopters, sonar system, warship, and multi-military command structures operating at the same time. And while it may sound simple on paper, indeed, carry it out in the real world is an incredibly complex operation.
Right, indeed. Then, Kelly, what more can you tell us about what analysts have been saying about the broader implications of South Korea leading this global maritime exercise this time around?
Yeah, I mean, analysts are basically saying that this is an opportunity for South Korea to lead 40 warships and essentially put itself on the world stage as a major naval leader of the quote-unquote free world, right? And although Korea likes to boast, its naval history, which is, quite robust, dating back to the days of the turtle ships, right? I think there is this overall impression, whether it's true or not, that Korea is kind of a beta military power, if you will, that is reliant on U.S. support in the conflict with North Korea and is always kind of walking this tightrope of alliances. But this is really an opportunity for South Korea to show its leadership abilities and its force. So like I said, they're leading 40 warships. That's no small task. I believe there's at least 20,000 personnel involved in these exercises. And the scale of this, I think, needs to be mentioned. I mean, we're talking about 29 countries countries are participating in these exercises, and really only a few of them have been assigned these kind of leadership roles. So besides South Korea, it's US, Canada, Chile, and Japan, essentially leading kind of various components such as like Air Force or the Navy, and some, armed drills and whatnot. So it's an opportunity for Korea to look like a leader on this front. Granted, South Korea's neighbor up north certainly is not going to like this. While North Korea likes to boast its own military capabilities and even kind of fudge them a little bit, sometimes on the global stage, it's been very clear in the past that it does not like these exercises, and it condemns their existence as well as Seoul's involvement in them.
Right. Chien-Hao, ahead of this defense drill, Singapore will host the annual Shangri-La dialogue starting, I believe, next Friday. What has been shared about its agenda for this year?
Yeah, so at this point, not many details about the Shangri-La dialogue agenda have been made publicly. So far, we've only received the session timetable. And this year's forum is expected to focus on 7 major topics, including the United States strategy for peace in the Indo-Pacific, priorities within Asia's shifting strategic landscapes, and Asia's maritime security disorder and addressing cross-regional security threats, China's cooperative partnerships in the Asia-Pacific, and managing regional tensions amid global competition, and finally, evolving security partnership in a fragmenting world. And as we know, the Shangri-La dialogue is one of the few occasions where military officials and defense representatives from across Europe and Asia, whether allies or rivals, can gather in the same place and exchange views directly. And as we just heard, both the United States and China are central to many of the discussions. And naturally, countries are trying to figure out how to deal with the uncertainty and even the risk of instability created by growing tensions between the two major powers, especially with the war in Ukraine continuing. And after the United States arrested Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro early this year, followed by strikes against Iran in the end of February, many observers believe that the United States' actions have become more aggressive since President Trump returned to office. And now there are concerns that tensions between the United States and Iran could become a prolonged conflict. And this kind of multi-front situation is forcing many countries to indeed reconsider the global balance of power. And on one hand, the United States still possesses overwhelming military strength, but some are questioning whether Washington can continue managing multiple crises at the same time. And on the other hand, there is also growing curiosity over whether China may try to use this opportunity to expand its influence or present itself in a new strategic role. And that's why it will be particularly interesting to see how those military leaders and defense officials at the Shangri-La dialogue choose to present their positions and how they respond to difficult questions from the international community.
Right then, keeping in mind the concerns raised by Chien-Hao, Kelly, what are pundits saying about the relevance of these multilateral dialogue platforms to deal with such geopolitical concerns?
Well, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find the pundit that doesn't believe in at least trying dialogue, right? I think we're at a point of we'll take what we can get, and talking is better than nothing. With that said, I do think that analysts over the last few years have put out a number of pieces and, opinion articles, essays, even scholarly research, kind of looking at this greater question of, is the importance or the actual results of these kinds of summits and forums lessening over time? So, I mean, there's been the argument again and again that the United Nations has essentially been rendered ineffective. Look at the Paris Accords, look at the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, there are many examples of a lot of effort being put into dialogue and cooperation, and then that essentially collapsing because of the whims of one major world leader or superpower that is involved, right? So I think what we're seeing is a little bit of, for lack of better words, apathy. I think there's always going to be a desire for dialogue, but there's kind of this realistic undercurrent that it may not actually result in that much tangible difference on some of these major sticking points between the US, China, Russia and Ukraine, Israel, parts of Europe. And so we'll have to see. With that said, I think a lot of this is happening because we have this kind of shake up in the world order where we've got China and the Trump administration, two major superpowers, and then Netanyahu in Israel, Putin in Russia, obviously North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, kind of far-right leaders that have risen in Europe, who are not necessarily world superpowers, but are not afraid of conflict, right? And come off as a little rogue or unpredictable. And so when you have all of these pleasantries and these kind of roadmaps being laid out by diplomats after these exhaustive summits, and then there's this feeling that it could essentially be blown up by the whims of one of these parties, I do think there is kind of this overall feeling that the efficacy of these kind of meetings are being limited, and in part being limited by the fact that these surrounding countries, South Korea included, are almost hesitant to act because they don't want to further destabilize the region.
Right, and yet I'm sure quite a number of pundits will agree that collaboration is better than confrontation.
Absolutely.
All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Kelly, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
And Chien-Hao, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right, that ends Press Perspective for today. We thank you for watching and return same time tomorrow with a panel session on a cross-border football tournament and more. Do join us then.